All right, AP Environmental. This is Unit 8, topics 8.2 to 8.8. This is the first of a couple of videos pertaining to these um, kind of subtopics in Unit 8, 8.2 to 8.8. So this is human impacts on aquatic ecosystems, human impacts on water. Um, so within this, or within these subtopics, again, 8.2 to 8.8, I'm going to spend a couple of different days, a few different lectures pertaining to these. So this is just part one for today. So I'm going to start today talking about the Cuyahoga River. If you're not familiar with where the Cuyahoga River is, it is in Cleveland, Ohio. This is the main river that kind of runs right around the city of Cleveland. Now, the reason why the Cuyahoga River is important is because of what happened to this river uh, back in the 1960s. This picture that you're seeing here is the Cuyahoga River. And in 1969, the river actually caught on fire. Literally, the water was on fire. That's what you're seeing here in the picture. Prior to this happening, the Cuyahoga River was one of the most polluted rivers in America. This was prior to the Clean Water Act. There really was nobody really looking to check and see, what pollutants were being dumped in the river. Back in the 1960s in Cleveland, Ohio, it was a very industrialized city, and all the waste from all the factories, whether it be chemical or otherwise, it was just dumped in this river. And it just kept building up and building up and building up. And eventually, one day, the river just caught fire because of all the chemical pollution that was in it. And it made the national news, and like people were like looking at Cleveland, like, what's going on in Cleveland? Like, why is your river like on fire? Well, this was kind of one of the major events that actually led to the development of the Clean Water Act eventually that came about in 1972. I talked a little bit about this yesterday in the lecture. But the Clean Water Act, one of the things that it does is it's legislation, it's a set of laws that eliminate any type of pollution in what we call navigable waters. Now, the term navigable, right, basically what that means is that the water can be used to transport any type of commerce. So basically, I look at it this way: if you can drive a boat on it, it's probably a navigable waterway. So it could be a lake, it could be a river, it could be um, ocean water. But if it's navigable, um, there is no pollution. One of the issues with navigable waters is there are some really, really small streams, for example, that are not really navigable. Like, you can't take a boat on those. So the Clean Water Act, when it was originally written, did not address those types of waters. Stopping discharge of toxic pollutants by individuals or industry. Yesterday, for example, I talked about point sources of pollution. The Clean Water Act addresses those. So if you're a factory or a CAFO and you're producing effluent, you can't do that. You cannot dump that stuff directly into a navigable body of water. And finally, it protects fish, shellfish, and other wildlife. This along with the Endangered Species Act, really does help to protect a lot of the wildlife that lives in navigable waters. Not navigable waters, not so much. So the big thing that the Clean Water Act allows is, again, for the government. In this case, it's the EPA. It's an extension of our government. It's a government branch to take legal action. They can basically sue people. They can fine you. They can put people in jail that break the law. That don't obey the Clean Water Act. Again, one of the big issues with the Clean Water Act is, again, it's only those navigable surface waters that get protected. Groundwater is not navigable. So, there's a whole other set of laws that kind of addresses groundwater, but the Clean Water Act, there's kind of a loophole in that where the groundwater resources aren't necessarily protected by the Clean Water Act. All right. This today is the Cuyahoga River. Again, there's Cleveland, Ohio in the background. This river looks much cleaner. It is much cleaner compared to what it was in 1969 when it was on fire. But again, that's the result of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act has allowed us to clean up some of these waterways that were extremely polluted. I'm not saying the Cuyahoga is totally clean, but compared to what it was in 1969, it's a lot cleaner. So that's kind of a nice thing. All right. Now we're about to get into a lot of different types of water pollution. Over the next couple of lectures, I'm going to go through 8 different things. Today, we're just going to focus on these first 3. Sediment pollution, thermal pollution, and eutrophication. We'll get into the other ones as we get through the next couple of lectures. So today we're going to start, before we get into those, just kind of a review topic. And I think this is a good point in time to actually review this. It's called range of tolerance. You guys might remember these graphs that we looked back. This is back in Unit 2. But range of tolerance, again, is just a range of conditions in which organisms can thrive under. For example, these 2 graphs at the bottom, we're plotting, number of individuals, we're plotting population versus some range of an environmental condition. Let's just use, I don't know, temperature as an example, right? Temperature is an environmental condition. So if you look, for example, at this graph on the left, this is the black stripe top minnow. The black stripe top minnow seems to have a fairly broad range of tolerance for that particular condition. Whereas the black-tail shiner, this other fish over here, has a much more limited range of tolerance for that particular environmental factor. So every organism, every species has its own range of tolerance. And what I want us to understand, this is just kind of a generic graph of it, but that part in the middle, kind of where we see that, kind of apex at the top, that would represent this optimum range of tolerance for that particular species. For example, if we go back to this, this area in here would be our optimal range, whereas over here it's much wider, right? So understand that width of that range can vary from one species to the next. But when we start to get out of that range, when you get over here, for example, if you look at this, how this is kind of shaped, it's kind of shaped like a bell curve. When you get on one side or the other side of it, then you get these organisms that start to become stressed. If you get, for example, if this is temperature, if it gets too hot, right, that would be on this side, or if it's too cold, which would be on this side, then you get stress. You get environmental stress on the organism, and that affects the population size. And if it gets too far away from it, then we call that the zone of intolerance, and then the species can't survive. So, for example, this line right in the middle, let's say that's a temperature. The farther we get from that temperature to the right, or the farther we get from it on the left, the less likely that species is going to be able to survive. Now, the reason why I want to talk about range of tolerance is because pollution has a big impact on environmental factors, things like temperature and pH and turbidity of the water, which is like water clarity. I mean, a whole bunch of environmental factors are affected by pollution. and that means it's going to affect these organisms that live in the water, whether it be fish or shrimp or whatever it might be. So let's talk about the first type of pollution here. This is sediment pollution. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this. Right? We know that moving water like rivers and streams carry sediments, silt, dirt, sand, whatever it is. But again, this is really enhanced by a lot of anthropogenic activities, things like construction on land, soil erosion due to deforestation, right? If we remove trees, they don't hold the soil as well. So that soil can eventually erode and get into the water. Number two is a big one. Overgrazing by animals, right? If animals are overgrazing, let's say a grassland area, then again, what that does is it loosens up the soil and allows it to erode into a local waterway. Then finally, dam construction. We talked about dams being built in the middle of rivers and all that sediment, building up behind it. That can build up and that can clog up the river and possibly cause flooding. 70% of all water sediments are due to human or anthropogenic activity. So, if we can limit these types of things near water, then we can limit sediment pollution. All right, so we know the causes of it. I'm going to go back to that real quick. Make sure you can list, I would say, at least two anthropogenic activities that can enhance sedimentation or siltation, we call that. I would know at least two of these, maybe three of them to be on the safe side. Now, we know the causes, but what are the effects, right? What happens when all of this sediment gets into water? One, it decreases water clarity, all right? Or another way to say that is it increases the turbidity. Turbidity means that it's becoming cloudier. So if the water clarity is decreasing, that means that the turbidity is increasing. Reduces sunlight penetration for plants, so it limits photosynthesis. All those sediments can clog the gills of fish. Sediments, especially when they run off of the land, they can carry nutrients, and that could cause eutrophication, which is a problem. Sediment deposits can lead to flooding. If they clog the river, that can cause flooding. So again, all of these things can impact fish migration as well. But again, all of these sediments, these are the effects of it. So, those effects, if those things start happening in our rivers and streams, we got to clean it. And it costs $16 billion a year for taxpayers in this country to actually clean up our waterways. And, that's part of our infrastructure. So, that's not a good thing. It's kind of expensive. It hits us in our pocketbooks. All right, thermal pollution. Now, thermal pollution, this is a different type of water pollution. It's not necessarily related to sediments or chemicals. It's related to water temperature. Um, we've talked about steel mill, or we've talked about power plants, coal power plants, nuclear power plants, but even steel mills and paper mills kind of do something similar. They remove cold water from, let's say, a lake or a river. They heat that water, right, to produce steam to turn the turbine, and then they put warm water back in its original source. So when that happens, and this picture here on the right, kind of shows you, it's kind of an infrared image. Here's the power plant here, right? So we've got cold water coming into the plant, but it's being heated here. And then that hot water is being discharged back into the original source. So you can see kind of all the orange and yellowish colors. That's warm water. Right? That's not normal for all that warmer water to be discharged. So that can cause some problems. Okay. It eventually warms up the water that originally is supposed to be much colder. Now, again, this is an industrial problem. Any of these types of things, coal and nuclear power plants, steel mills and paper mills, they all do this. Now, one way to prevent it would be to cool the water before you put it back in. Some power plants do that, some of them don't. All right, the ones that don't can cause a lot of thermal pollution. Now, there's another thing that can cause thermal pollution, and I would know this one as well, and that's deforestation. I mean, just take a look at this aerial photo, right? You got a river here, kind of flowing through this forested area. Think about all those trees. They supply a lot of shade, which cools the water. So if you remove all those trees, that's going to reduce shade. That's going to warm the water up. All right. And again, when you warm the water up, that changes. I go back to range of tolerance. That's going to affect a lot of aquatic organisms that live in that water. Now, one of the things that it does is it produces something called thermal shock. If you have cold water, like for example, let's say this reservoir here, let's say this water is typically, I don't know, let's say 70 degrees, Fahrenheit. If all of a sudden you pump, 85-degree water into it, that's going to create much warmer conditions. Here's something to remember. Hot water contains less oxygen. The dissolved oxygen that's in the water, there's less of that in warmer water than there is cold water. So if you start pumping in a bunch of warm water, that's actually going to remove oxygen from the water, and that's going to affect fish. So now you have this situation where there's less oxygen, but the water is warmer. So those fish are going to be breathing more, right? Because it's warmer. I mean, that affects their respiratory rate. And this combination of faster breathing and no oxygen, that's going to lead to death. So, this picture here with all these fish floating on top of the lake or whatever this is, that's all because of thermal shock, because the water got so warm so quickly, the fish couldn't adjust to that. So it got outside of their range of tolerance, and in this case, they all ended up dying. All right, now the last thing today I want to talk about again is eutrophication. Again, we've talked about this several times. So, we know that eutrophication is when a body of water, for whatever reasons, becomes loaded with nutrients. And again, the two nutrients that you need to know are nitrogen or nitrates and phosphorus or phosphates. Those are limiting nutrients for plants. The more of those there are, the more plant growth you're going to have, the more algae you're going to have. Now, again, this can happen a couple of different ways. You need to know all of these. Fertilizer runoff can cause it, right? Nitrates that are in fertilizers. Animal waste from CAFOs that contains nitrates and phosphates. Wastewater. Now, that could be gray water, like soapy water from your homes, that contains phosphates, and also human excrement, like human sewage, that can contain nitrates. The thing is, like in the United States, we do a pretty good job of treating our wastewater. So these things that eventually get into, um, or that these things that eventually could get into local waterways, we do a pretty good job of keeping those things out. Other countries, they don't do a very good job of that. I want to go back to this term here real quick. This is dissolved oxygen. So this is the oxygen that's in the water. If you look at this little chart here, it kind of shows you the range of dissolved oxygen tolerance for fish. Dissolved oxygen is measured in parts per million. How many parts of oxygen are there per million parts of water, or per million water molecules, I guess. So when you get into this range down here of like, 3 parts per million, 4 parts per million, that's not enough oxygen for fish. Like fish cannot live in this range. There's just not enough. When you get up here, into, let's say, the 7, 8, 9, 10 range or higher, that is enough dissolved oxygen to support fish populations. So ideally, fish populations probably need, I would say, probably 7 or more, to really thrive as far as dissolved oxygen goes. But eutrophication affects dissolved oxygen. Remember, we talked about, algae blooms. When that happens, that's going to impact the dissolved oxygen. Now, there's another term here that this is a new term that you're going to have to know. It's called biochemical oxygen demand. Now, biochemical oxygen demand is, or that's they call it biological oxygen demand, it's the same thing, or we call it BOD. This is the amount of oxygen that a quantity of water uses over a period of time at a specific temperature. So let's just say room temperature for now, just whatever, just for practicalities. If you have, let's say, a liter of pond water, like from some local pond, in that water, there's a bunch of organisms that live there, right? There's a bunch of microbes and a bunch of decomposers and funguses and whatever lives in there. But those organisms that live in that water, they need oxygen. So if you've got a body of water that has a high BOD, that means those organisms are demanding a lot of oxygen. That's an indicator of pollution. If you have a body of water that has a low BOD, that means that those organisms are not requiring a lot of oxygen, probably because there aren't very many organisms in there. So if we're actually going to apply numbers to this, and you don't necessarily have to know this, but for example, like normal fresh water, just like, I don't know, let's say a local stream that's not really polluted, the BOD is about 5 to 20 milligrams of oxygen per liter of water. So those organisms would require that much oxygen to survive. But if you've got a polluted body of water, I mean, it can get up to almost 200. So what that's telling us, what those high levels of oxygen demand are telling us, is that there is a lot of microbes, most likely decomposers, that are requiring a lot of oxygen to survive. So that is an indicator. We use BOD to indicate to us that the water is polluted, really. I mean, now why it's polluted or how it's polluted, that's a different story. But this is an indicator that there's something in that water that is causing all of these microbes, all these decomposers to demand all of this oxygen. All right, now the last thing here, and this is just a review here, okay? So algae blooms, of course, when there's eutrophication, decomposers feed on it, and those decomposers use oxygen, right? They're heterotrophic. So the last thing here that I want to cover today is something called an oxygen sag curve. There's a video that I put in Buzz in your agenda for today. So if you don't understand this, you want to watch that short video. It's given by a different person that maybe they can explain it better than me, but I think I can explain it pretty well. So what you're seeing here in this picture, this is a body of water. This represents a river, right, or a stream. So at the bottom down here, you'll notice it says the current. There's an arrow that's pointing in this direction. So the water is flowing, to the right. This is a moving body of water. So what we're going to just kind of assume today is that in this river, there is some pollution. Okay, so here's let's say some drainage pipe that is releasing, I don't know, sewage or some type of organic pollution. But remember, the river is flowing in this direction. It's flowing to the right. So in this area to the left over here, right, this area is not being exposed to the pollution, because this polluted water, which is coming in here, and that we call this the decomposition zone, that water is moving to the right. So in this clean zone over here, there's no pollution. It's only happening at this particular spot. Now, I want us to think a little bit about this, this red line. This red line represents BOD. It represents biological oxygen demand. So you'll notice over here in the clean zone, the BOD is fairly low because there's not a lot of organisms over here that are demanding a ton of oxygen. You probably have some fish over here, but as far as like a bunch of microorganisms and decomposers that are demanding a bunch of oxygen, you don't have any of that over here in the clean zone. But over here in the decomposition zone, this is where all the pollution is coming in, right? This is where the algae bloom is going to occur. And this is where you're going to have all the algae die and eventually get decomposed. That's why they call it the decomposition zone. So in this area here, in this decomposition zone, this is where your BOD is going to spike because there's so many organisms that are demanding oxygen that this level is going to go really, really high right where the source of pollution is. Now, as we travel downstream, all right, that biological oxygen demand is going to start dropping. All right, and it drops, once we get into this, well, we'll talk about why we call this the septic zone in a minute, but eventually there's the recovery zone, and eventually we get what we call the clear zone, which, that's kind of further down the stream, further downstream from the pollution. This is where the water can start possibly getting clear again and, kind of resort back to like a cleaner zone of water. But this other line here, this is our dissolved oxygen. So think about what's happening here, right? Over in the clean zone, we've got a lot of dissolved oxygen. This oxygen can be used by any living thing that's in the clean zone, but you don't have a lot of decomposers over here. You have fish, but again, when we get into this decomposition zone here, this is where all the pollution is. So we have all of those decomposers using the oxygen. So think about what happens to our dissolved oxygen levels. They are dropping tremendously. Now, if you get in over here to the septic zone, this is a little bit further downstream from where the pollution is. This is what we call the sag point. This is the low point in the level of dissolved oxygen. So in this area, this is the septic zone. All right, that area is the worst zone for living things because there's just no dissolved oxygen at all. And it's actually a little bit downstream from where the pollution is actually happening. So in this septic zone here, there's no fish. This is your dead zone. We call it the dead zone as well, right? That's where all of that, all those fish are dead because there's no oxygen in the water. The only thing that can live there is decomposers, right? But that's pretty much it. But again, when you get downstream a little bit more, right, there's less pollution, so that dissolved oxygen starts to come up a little bit, and eventually it gets back to the clear zones, which those levels get much higher. So oxygen sag curves. All right, understand what this red line represents, understand what this green line represents, and understand what's going on, especially in these decomposition and these septic zones when it comes to the pollution. But eventually, what this results in are these dead zones. We've talked about it before. This is hypoxia, right? When there's no oxygen in the water. Um, there's more than 400 of these dead zones. One of the most notorious ones, again, is down here in Louisiana, right down where the Mississippi River Delta is, where all that water drains from the Mississippi, eventually down into the Gulf of Mexico. There's 400 dead zones. In the 1980s, there's only 87 of them. So now, there's a huge increase in these things around the world, and a lot of it has to do with just this eutrophication that's going on, and again, all the oxygen that's being removed from the water. So there's some major issues with this. All right, guys, that's it for today. That was a big video, lots of stuff there. So make sure you rewatch it if you need to, or rewatch parts of it. Again, if you don't understand sag curves, watch that short video that I put in the Buzz agenda for today. That might help you a little bit. All right, guys, have a good day. Take care. No.